It happened on a night that had already gone too far. I remember the exact moment, because everything before it feels blurred now, like trying to focus on something underwater. We had been watching some forgettable thriller, the kind with too many explosions and not enough plot. The credits were rolling across Maxwell's laptop screen, casting shifting shadows against the wall of my cramped apartment. Empty beer bottles stood sentinel on the coffee table between us, and the air smelled of pizza grease and the vanilla candle I had lit hours earlier to mask the staleness of too many nights spent indoors. Maxwell was sprawled beside me on my secondhand couch, his long legs stretched out, one arm draped over the back cushions. His presence filled the small space in that way it always did, magnetic and effortless, like he belonged everywhere he chose to be. His dark hair was mussed from running his hands through it during the movie's more ridiculous moments, and there was still the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth from some joke he had made about the protagonist's terrible aim. We had been friends for 2 years by then. 2 years of late nights like this one, of shared silences that felt more intimate than conversation, of moments when the space between us seemed to shrink without either of us acknowledging it. Maxwell was the kind of person who drew people in without trying, who could make a room feel smaller just by walking into it. But with me, it was different. With me, he let his guard down in ways I had learned to catalog and treasure, storing away each unguarded laugh, each moment when he forgot to perform the easy charm that came so naturally to him around everyone else. I had been in love with him for most of those 2 years, a fact I had buried so deep I sometimes convinced myself it wasn't true. It was easier that way, safer. Maxwell dated women with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned what he wanted. He talked about them sometimes, these girlfriends who came and went like seasons, and I would nod and offer the appropriate responses while something sharp and unnamed twisted in my chest. But that night felt different from the start. There had been electricity in the air, a tension I couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. Our usual easy banter had given way to something quieter, more charged. When he laughed at my commentary during the movie, his eyes lingered on my face a beat too long. When I reached for another beer, our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled away immediately. The movie ended, and we didn't move to start another one. We just sat there in the flickering light of the laptop screen, the silence stretching between us like a hell breath. I could hear the hum of my ancient refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic on the street below, the rhythm of Maxwell's breathing beside me. Everything felt heightened, like the world had been turned up to a frequency I could barely stand. I don't remember exactly how it started. Maybe I shifted closer while we were talking, or maybe he did. Maybe it was gradual, the way these things sometimes are, a slow erosion of the careful distance we usually maintained. All I know is that at some point, my hand found its way to his leg, resting just above his knee in what could have been mistaken for casual friendliness. But it wasn't casual, and we both knew it. Maxwell didn't move away. He kept talking, his voice steady, but I could feel the subtle change in his breathing, the way his muscles tensed slightly under my palm. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. The conversation we had been having faded into background noise as every part of my attention focused on that single point of contact, on the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his jeans. Slowly, without conscious decision, my hand began to drift higher. Just an inch, maybe 2, but enough to cross some invisible line we had never explicitly drawn but had always respected. Maxwell's words faltered mid-sentence. His eyes flicked down to where my hand rested on his thigh, then back to my face, and I saw something there I had never seen before. Not quite fear, but something close to it. Recognition, maybe. The moment when someone realizes they are standing at the edge of a cliff they hadn't known they were approaching. That's when he said it. His voice was quieter than usual, unsteady in a way that made my chest tighten with something between hope and terror. "Don't touch me there." The words hung in the air between us, clear and unmistakable. A boundary drawn in sharp black lines. A request, or maybe a command. A reminder of who we were supposed to be to each other, of the safe roles we had been playing for 2 years. But he didn't move. That's what I remember most clearly about that moment. more clearly than the sound of his voice, or the expression on his face, or the way the candlelight caught in his dark eyes. He didn't move. Not an inch. His body remained exactly as it was, my hand still resting on his thigh, his breathing still shallow and quick. The words said one thing, but his stillness said something else entirely. I should have pulled away. Any reasonable person would have pulled away, would have mumbled an apology, and suggested we watch another movie or call it a night. But I couldn't move either. I was frozen between what he had said and what he wasn't doing, caught in the space between his words and his silence. The room felt impossibly small suddenly, like the walls were pressing in around us. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the blood rushing through my veins. Maxwell's eyes were locked on mine now, wide and dark, and full of something I couldn't name but recognized all the same. It was the look of someone who had just realized they were drowning and couldn't decide whether to fight the current or let it carry them under. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Time had become elastic, unreliable. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. The laptop screen had gone black, leaving us in the warm amber glow of the candle. And in that light, Maxwell looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way I had rarely seen him. His usual confidence had cracked, and through the fissures I caught glimpses of something raw and uncertain and achingly familiar. Finally, I found my voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "You said don't touch you there." He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "But you didn't move," I continued, the words feeling dangerous and necessary at the same time. Maxwell's breathing had grown shallower, and I could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him. "I know." Those two words contained multitudes. Admission and denial, fear and want, everything we had been dancing around for months distilled into a single breath. I felt something shift in my chest, some long-held tension finally finding release. He knew. He knew what this was, what this meant, and he hadn't moved away. The silence that followed felt different than before, charged with new possibility. We were no longer pretending not to understand what was happening between us. The careful fiction we had maintained was crumbling, and in its place something truer and more frightening was taking shape. I knew, even in that moment, that nothing would be the same after this. That whatever happened next would irrevocably change the shape of our friendship, the comfortable dynamic we had built over 2 years of careful boundaries and unspoken agreements. But I also knew that there was no going back now, no way to unknow what we both suddenly understood with crystalline clarity. A line had been crossed, just as I had suspected, but it hadn't been crossed by accident, and it hadn't been crossed by me alone. It had been crossed by both of us, in the space between his words and his stillness, in the moment when he chose not to move away from something he claimed not to want. I am 22 years old, a graduate student in philosophy at a university that feels too small for the weight of my thoughts. My apartment reflects this restlessness perfectly. Books stacked in precarious towers on every available surface, coffee cups scattered like archaeological evidence of sleepless nights, notes scrawled on napkins and tucked between pages of Sartre and Beauvoir. The place smells perpetually of coffee grounds and the faint mustiness of old paperbacks bought secondhand from the bookstore downtown. Most nights, I work until dawn breaks pale and uncertain through the single window of my living room. My dissertation advisor calls it dedication. I call it avoidance. It's easier to lose myself in questions about consciousness and free will than to examine the particular consciousness that keeps me awake, the specific lack of freedom I feel when Maxwell walks into a room. Maxwell is 23, a business major with the kind of easy confidence I've always envied. Where I overthink every interaction, he moves through the world with an assurance that seems almost genetic. His laugh fills spaces in a way that makes everyone else want to join in. When he talks, people lean forward without realizing it, drawn by something magnetic and unforced. He has dark hair that he's always pushing back from his forehead, and eyes that shift between green and brown, depending on the light. I spent more time than I care to admit cataloging these details, storing them away like a collector of beautiful things. We met during sophomore year in a European history class neither of us particularly wanted to take. I was there because it fulfilled a requirement. He was there because his girlfriend at the time had convinced him it would be easy. We ended up sitting next to each other by accident, or what I told myself was accident. And something clicked immediately. Not romantic, not then. Just recognition, the way you might recognize your own reflection in an unexpected mirror. Maxwell has always been the kind of person who makes friends easily, but our friendship felt different from start. More deliberate, somehow. He would seek me out after class, suggest we grab coffee, invite himself over to study even though we rarely opened our books. I told myself it was because I was different from his other friends, quieter, more serious, someone who could match his energy when he needed to talk through an idea, but who could also sit in comfortable silence when words felt unnecessary. The truth was more complicated. Maxwell needed me in a way that his other friendships didn't seem to require. He was steady with everyone else, the reliable one who cracked jokes when conversations got too heavy, who could diffuse tension with a well-timed observation about the absurdity of college life. But with me, he let the mask slip. He would show up at my apartment after particularly difficult phone calls with his father, or after dates that hadn't gone the way he'd hoped, and we would sit on my couch until whatever was troubling him worked itself out through conversation or simple proximity. I had been in love with him for most of the 2 years we'd known each other, though I'd become skilled at disguising this fact, even for myself. It was easier to think of my feelings as intense friendship, to explain away the way my pulse quickened when he laughed at something I'd said, or the way I found excuses to touch his shoulder, his arm, his hand, when he dated other people, and he dated frequently, casually, the way some people tried on clothes. I told myself the sharp feeling in my chest was protectiveness, not jealousy. Maxwell approached relationships with the same easy confidence he brought to everything else. The women he dated were usually bright and beautiful, the kind of people who seemed to glide through life without questioning whether they belonged wherever they found themselves. He would tell me about them sometimes, in the abstract way people discuss pleasant but ultimately forgettable experiences. There was Sarah from his economics class, who laughed too loudly at movies. There was Emma, who worked at the campus bookstore and had strong opinions about organic coffee. There was Jessica, who lasted longer than most, almost 3 months, before they mutually agreed they were better as friends. I learned to nod at appropriate moments during these conversations, to ask the right questions, to offer advice that was generous and helpful, while something inside me withered a little more each time. Maxwell never seemed to struggle with these relationships the way I struggled with my feelings for him. They came and went like weather patterns, natural and unremarkable, leaving him unchanged. But even during those times when he was dating someone else, our friendship remained constant. If anything, it seemed to deepen. He would still spend more nights on my couch than at his own place. He would still call me when he couldn't sleep, when some philosophical question had occurred to him at 2 in the morning and he needed to work through it aloud. He would still show up with takeout from the Thai place we both loved, still sprawl across my living room floor to read while I worked at my desk. There were moments scattered across those 2 years when I wondered if he felt something similar. A pause that lasted too long after a joke. The way he would look at me, sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his expression unreadable but intense. The fact that he never brought his girlfriend around when I was there never suggested we all hang out together the way friends usually do. But I was good at explaining these moments away, at finding reasonable interpretations that didn't require me to risk the friendship I treasured. Maxwell was thoughtful, that was all. He was the kind of person who paid attention to the people he cared about, who noticed when something was bothering you before you realized it yourself. The pauses were just in processing what I'd said. The looks were concern, affection, the normal care one friend shows another. Until that night when my hand slipped higher than it should have, when he told me not to touch him there, but didn't move away. Until that moment when all my careful explanations crumbled under the weight of what we both suddenly understood but couldn't yet name. The next morning arrived with the kind of harsh sunlight that makes everything from the night before feel like a fever dream. I woke on the couch where we had both eventually fallen asleep, Maxwell's jacket draped over my shoulders like evidence of something I wasn't sure had really happened. He was already awake, standing in my kitchen with his back to me, making coffee with the easy familiarity of someone who had done this dozens of times before. When he turned around, mug in hand, his smile was exactly the same as it had always been. Warm, effortless, completely unchanged. He asked if I wanted coffee, commented on how terrible the movie had been, made some joke about my ancient laptop finally giving up the ghost. Every word, every gesture was so perfectly normal that I began to doubt my own memory of what had transpired between us. Had his breathing really changed when my hand found his thigh? Had those words, "Don't touch me there," really carried the weight I remembered? Or had I imagined the tremor in his voice? Had he truly remained frozen beneath my touch? Or had I constructed that stillness out of wishful thinking and sleep deprivation? Maxwell moved through my apartment that morning like he always did, straightening books, rinsing out his coffee mug, gathering his things with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose conscience was entirely clear. When he bumped my shoulder on his way to the door, it felt exactly like every other casual touch we had shared over 2 years of friendship. When he said he'd see me later, his voice held no trace of the uncertainty I was sure I had heard the night before. I spent most of that day convincing myself I had imagined everything that mattered. But that evening, when Maxwell showed up at my door with Chinese takeout and that same easy grin, something was different. Not in what he said or did, but in the spaces between words, in the quality of silence that settled around us. He sat closer to me on the couch than usual, close enough that I could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. When we talked, his attention seemed more focused, more deliberate, as if he were listening not just to my words but to something underneath them. The movie we chose was forgettable, some comedy neither of us had seen before. But I found myself watching Maxwell more than the screen, cataloging the small differences in his behavior. The way he laughed just a beat too late at jokes, as if part of his mind were elsewhere. The way his eyes would drift to my face during quiet moments, then snap back to the television when he caught himself looking. The way he kept adjusting his position on the couch, shifting closer by degrees until our knees were almost touching. I told myself I was reading too much into everything, that this was just my imagination painting significance onto perfectly ordinary moments. But then, halfway through the movie, when I reached for the remote that had fallen between the cushions, my hand brushed against his thigh again. Not accidentally this time, but not with the deliberate intent of the night before either. Something in between, a test, maybe, or a question posed in a language neither of us had learned to speak. Maxwell went completely still. It was the same stillness as before, the same held breath quality that had made time feel elastic and strange. But this time I was watching for it, waiting to see if I had imagined that response or if it was real. His eyes found mine in the dim light from the television, and I saw recognition there, the acknowledgement that we were both remembering the same moment, feeling the same tension that had never quite dissipated despite the morning's performance of normalcy. My hand remained where it was, neither advancing nor retreating. Maxwell didn't speak this time, didn't draw any verbal boundaries. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't decode, something caught between want and fear and a third emotion I didn't have a name for yet. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions. The comedy playing on my laptop became background noise, irrelevant to the real drama unfolding in the small space of my living room. I could hear Maxwell's breathing, shallow and careful, could feel the minute tremor in the leg beneath my palm. He wasn't pulling away, wasn't telling me to stop, but he wasn't encouraging me either. He was simply existing in that moment of contact, letting it happen without claiming it, without naming what it meant. When I finally spoke, my voice came out quieter than I intended, barely audible over the sound of Ken's laughter from the movie. "You keep saying no, but you never move." The words hung in the air like a confession, like an accusation, like a prayer. Maxwell's eyes never left mine as he processed what I had said, and I watched something shift in his expression, some internal door opening just enough to let in a sliver of light. His response, when it came, was so soft I almost missed it, because I don't know how to. The admission hit me like a physical thing, settling in my chest with a weight that was both painful and exhilarating. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the no I had been expecting either. It was something more complex, more honest. An acknowledgement of the impossible position we had created for ourselves, the space between wanting something and being able to admit that want. I felt my pulse quicken, felt that familiar flutter of hope mixed with terror. Maxwell was looking at me, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing he needed to make a choice, but paralyzed by the magnitude of what lay on either side. Jump or stay safe. Risk everything or preserve what we already had. And in that moment, I realized it was enough. Not his permission, not his encouragement, but his honesty. The acknowledgement that something was happening between us, something neither of us fully understood, but both of us felt. It was enough to keep going, enough to see where this impossible situation might lead. The movie continued playing, but neither of us was watching anymore. We sat in that charged silence, my hand still resting on his thigh, both of us breathing carefully, both of us pretending we didn't know exactly what was happening even as we let it continue to unfold. After that night, our friendship began to unravel into something we had no name for. It wasn't a sudden transformation, not the kind of dramatic shift you might expect after such a loaded confession. Instead, it was like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom, the image emerging slowly, details becoming clearer by degrees, until what had always been there, but invisible, finally took shape before our eyes. Maxwell continued to show up at my apartment with the same frequency as before, but the quality of his presence had changed. Where he had once sprawled across my furniture with careless confidence, he now moved with a new kind of awareness, as if he were constantly conscious of the space between our bodies and the various ways that space might be crossed. When he sat on my couch, he would position himself just close enough to make the proximity feel deliberate, but not so close that it couldn't be explained away as coincidence. I found myself testing the boundaries of this new dynamic with the careful precision of a scientist conducting experiments. A hand placed on his shoulder while reaching for something just beyond him. Fingers that lingered when passing him a book or a coffee mug. Glances that lasted a beat too long, loaded with questions I wasn't ready to ask directly. Each small transgression was met not with resistance, but with a kind of breathless stillness, as if Maxwell were holding himself perfectly motionless to avoid disrupting whatever fragile thing was taking shape between us. The conversations we had during those weeks began to carry double meanings, layers of subtext that made even mundane exchanges feel charged with significance. When he complained about the girl from his marketing class who kept texting him, I heard the unspoken question, what should I do with attention I don't want? When I mentioned how tired I was of being alone, I watched his face for signs that he understood what kind of loneliness I was really describing. We developed a language of silences, of things left unsaid that somehow communicated more than words ever could. Maxwell would arrive at my door looking unsettled, and I would make room for him on the couch without asking what was wrong. He would fall asleep during movies with his head tilted toward my shoulder, and I would remain perfectly still until my muscles cramped rather than risk waking him. These moments felt precious and precarious, like we were building something out of materials that might disintegrate if handled too roughly. But it was the touching that changed everything. What had begun as accidental contact evolved into something more deliberate, though neither of us acknowledged the shift explicitly. My hand would find its way to his arm while we talked, resting there with a casualness that fooled neither of us. His fingers would brush mine when we reached for the same object, the contact lasting just long enough to register as intentional. When we sat close enough for our thighs to touch, neither of us would move away, even when the position became uncomfortable. Maxwell never initiated these moments of contact, but he never prevented them either. He existed in a state of careful passivity, allowing whatever I offered without asking for more, without admitting what any of it meant. It was as if he had decided that as long as he didn't actively participate, he could maintain some fiction of innocence, some story about himself that remained intact despite all evidence to the contrary. I began to understand that Maxwell was caught in an impossible position, trapped between what he wanted and what he believed about himself. Every time my hand found his thigh, every time our fingers intertwined while we watched movies, he was forced to confront the gap between his actions and his identity. And every time, he chose to remain frozen rather than resolve the contradiction, suspended in a liminal space where nothing had to be decided or named. The tension became almost unbearable. We would sit together in my living room, the air thick with unspoken desire, both of us hyper-aware of every breath, every shift in position, every moment when the space between us contracted or expanded. Maxwell would watch me with an intensity that made my skin feel too warm, his eyes tracking the movement of my hands, the way I crossed and uncrossed my legs, the unconscious gestures that revealed more than I intended. One evening, after we had spent nearly an hour in this state of heightened awareness, I decided to push further than I had before. Not dramatically. I had learned that Maxwell responded better to gradual escalation than to sudden movements, but definitively enough that there could be no mistaking my intentions. When he reached for his water glass on the coffee table, I intercepted his hand with mine, linking our fingers together with a deliberateness that made the gesture impossible to dismiss as accident. Maxwell froze, his breath catching in a way that was becoming familiar, his eyes wide and dark in the lamplight. But he didn't pull away. He never pulled away. I could feel his pulse through the contact points where our skin met, rapid and uneven, betraying the calm expression he tried to maintain. His hand was warm and slightly damp with perspiration, trembling almost imperceptibly in a way that told me everything I needed to know about his internal state. We sat like that for several minutes, hands joined, neither of us speaking, both of us staring at our interlaced fingers as if they held some crucial piece of information we needed to decode. The silence was no longer comfortable, but charged, electric, full of everything we weren't saying and probably never would. Finally, Maxwell whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him, "I don't understand what's happening to me." The words were barely audible, but they landed with the force of a shout. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging that something was indeed happening, that the careful dance we had been performing had real stakes and real consequences. It wasn't a confession exactly, but it was an admission of confusion, of being in uncharted territory where the rules he had always lived by no longer seemed to apply. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday night that started like all the others. Maxwell had arrived at my apartment around 9, carrying takeout from the Indian restaurant we both loved and wearing the kind of forced casualness that had become his default expression whenever he crossed my threshold. We ate while watching some documentary about deep-sea creatures, making the usual comments about the absurdity of evolution and the strange beauty of things that lived in perpetual darkness. But underneath our familiar banter, I could feel the same electric tension that had been building between us for weeks, growing stronger each time we failed to address it directly. After we finished eating, Maxwell stretched out on the couch with his usual practiced ease, but I noticed the way his body remained slightly tense, as if he were prepared to move quickly if circumstances required it. I settled beside him, leaving what had become our customary distance, close enough to feel the heat from his skin, far enough away to maintain the fiction that this was just friendship, nothing more complicated than two people sharing space and time. The documentary played, but neither of us was really watching. I could feel Maxwell's awareness of me, like a physical presence, could sense the way his breathing changed when I shifted position or reached for my water glass. The air between us had become dense with all the things we weren't saying, all the questions we weren't asking, all the boundaries we kept approaching but never quite crossing. About halfway through the documentary, during a segment about bioluminescent jellyfish, I made my decision. I didn't plan it, didn't spend time weighing the consequences or rehearsing what I might say afterward. I simply let my hand drift toward his, slowly and deliberately, until my fingers were tracing patterns on his palm. Maxwell's breath caught, but he didn't pull away. His hand remained open beneath mine, passive but welcoming, trembling slightly with the effort of staying still. I could feel his pulse through the thin skin of his wrist, rapid and unsteady, betraying the calm expression he was trying to maintain. The documentary continued playing, but the sound seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the blood rushing in my ears and the intensity of focus that had narrowed my world to this single point of contact. For several minutes, we existed in that suspended state, my fingers moving gently across his palm while he remained frozen beside me. It was the furthest we had ever gone, the most explicit acknowledgement of what was happening between us, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us like atmospheric pressure. Then, without warning, Maxwell's hand closed around mine. Not pulling away, not pushing me back, but holding on. His fingers intertwined with mine, with a desperation that spoke of weeks of careful restraint finally giving way to something more honest. His grip was firm and warm and slightly damp with perspiration, and I could feel the minute tremors running through his muscles like aftershocks from an earthquake. When I looked at his face, I saw that his eyes were closed, his jaw clenched with the effort of some internal struggle I could only guess at. He looked like someone in pain, but also like someone experiencing relief for the first time in months. The contradiction was written across his features in lines of tension and release, fear and surrender. We sat like that until the documentary ended, hands joined, both of us breathing carefully, both of us afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile understanding we had reached. When the credits began to roll, Maxwell finally opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, raw and vulnerable and tinged with something that might have been grief. That's when I asked the question that had been building inside me for weeks. Why don't you stop me? The words came out quietly, but they seemed to echo in the small space of my living room. Maxwell's grip on my hand tightened, and I watched him struggle with how to respond, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as if he were trying out different answers and finding them all inadequate. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with emotion I couldn't name. Because if I stop you, I lose the only thing I've been waiting for. The confession hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and sending shock waves through my nervous system. All those weeks of careful interpretation, of reading meaning into glances and silences and moments of stillness. And here was the truth laid bare in a single sentence. He had been waiting for this, not just allowing it or enduring it, but actively hoping for it, even as he remained unable to ask for it directly. I felt something shift in my chest, some long-held tension finally releasing. The truth had always been there, buried beneath layers of fear and denial and social expectation. But now it was spoken aloud, made real by the sound of his voice, saying words he had probably never imagined himself capable of saying. Maxwell was looking at me now with an expression of complete vulnerability, as if he had just handed me something precious and fragile and was waiting to see whether I would cherish it or destroy it. His face was flushed, his breathing shallow and quick, and I could see the rapid pulse jumping at the base of his throat. The documentary credits had finished rolling, leaving us in the soft glow of lamplight, hands still joined, the weight of his confession settling between us like snow. Everything that came after this moment would be different, I realized. There would be no going back to the careful dance we had been performing, no returning to the safe ambiguity we had maintained for so long. The truth was out now, spoken and heard and acknowledged, and there was no turning back. The confession hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Maxwell's admission that he had been waiting for something he couldn't name or ask for had shifted the entire landscape of our relationship. The careful ambiguity we had maintained for weeks was gone, replaced by a truth so raw it seemed to pulse in the air between us. His hand was still locked in mine, his grip alternating between desperate and gentle, as if he couldn't decide whether to hold on tighter or let go entirely. For several minutes, we sat in silence, both of us processing the magnitude of what he had revealed. I could hear the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the hum of my ancient refrigerator, the rhythm of our unsteady breathing. Everything felt hyper-real, every sensation amplified by the intensity of the moment. The lamplight seemed brighter, the air thicker, the weight of Maxwell's presence beside me more substantial than it had ever been. I knew we had reached a point where silence was no longer sustainable. Too much had been said to retreat back into the safety of unspoken understanding. Too much had been acknowledged to pretend we didn't know what was happening between us. The tension that had been building for weeks could no longer be contained within the boundaries of careful touches and loaded glances. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded strange to my own ears, rougher than usual, charged with an urgency I had been suppressing for months. Then stop lying to yourself. Say what you want. The words came out more forcefully than I had intended, but I didn't regret them. We had spent too long dancing around the truth, too many nights sitting in charged silence while both of us waited for the other to make the first move. If Maxwell had been waiting for something, then he needed to find the courage to name it, to claim it, to stop hiding behind the fiction that he was merely a passive participant in whatever was happening between us. Maxwell's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went pale, then flushed deep red, and I could see the panic flickering in his eyes. His grip on my hand loosened, and for a moment I thought he might pull away entirely, might retreat back into the safe distance we had maintained for so long. But he didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, trembling slightly, staring at me with an expression that was equal parts terror and longing. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him. I don't know if I can say it. The admission was barely audible, but it carried the weight of everything he had been struggling with. I could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the conflict between what he wanted and what he believed about himself, between desire and the identity he had constructed over 23 years of assuming he knew who he was. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that jumping would change everything but unable to find the courage to leap. I felt a surge of something that was part compassion, part frustration, part desperate love for this man who was so afraid of his own truth. Maxwell had always been the confident one in our friendship, the person who moved through the world with easy assurance, who never seemed to doubt himself or question his place in any room he entered. Seeing him reduced to this state of paralyzed vulnerability was both heartbreaking and oddly reassuring. Proof that what was happening between us mattered enough to shake him to his core. I shifted closer to him on the couch, closing what little distance remained between us until I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something earthier and more intimate. Maxwell's breathing became shallower as I moved closer, his eyes widening with a mixture of anticipation and fear. "Then show me," I said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. It was both a challenge and an invitation, a way for him to express what he couldn't put into words without having to cross that final line of verbal acknowledgement. I watched him process what I was asking, saw the moment when understanding flickered across his features, followed immediately by a look of such raw want that it took my breath away. For a long moment, Maxwell remained frozen, caught between impulse and inhibition. I could see him fighting with himself, weighing the safety of continuing to pretend against the relief of finally acting on what we both knew he felt. His free hand had curled into a fist at his side, knuckles white with tension, and I could hear the rapid rhythm of his breathing in the quiet room. Then something shifted in his expression, some internal wall finally cracking under the pressure of weeks of suppressed desire. His eyes darkened, and I saw him make the decision before he moved, saw the exact moment when he stopped fighting himself and surrendered to what he wanted. Maxwell leaned toward me with a sudden, desperate urgency, as if he were afraid that hesitating would give him time to change his mind. His free hand came up to frame my face, fingers trembling against my cheek, and I could feel the fine tremor running through his entire body. When his lips met mine, it was with the force of weeks of careful restraint finally breaking down. All the words he couldn't say poured into a single, breathless moment of contact. The kiss was hard and desperate and tinged with something that might have been grief for the time we had wasted, for the fear that had kept us apart, for the versions of ourselves we were about to leave behind. I could taste the salt of tears on his lips, though I wasn't sure if they were his or mine. His hand in my hair was gentle despite the intensity of the kiss, as if even in this moment of abandon, he was afraid of going too far too fast. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, Maxwell rested his forehead against mine and whispered the words I'd been waiting months to hear. "I don't want you to stop." The confession was raw and honest and completely without pretense, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless and aching for longer than I cared to remember. This was what I had been hoping for, what I had been building toward through weeks of careful touches and loaded silences. Not just physical contact, but emotional honesty. Not just desire, but the courage to claim it. 3 months have passed since that night, and I am sitting in the same apartment, on the same secondhand couch, with the same man who once told me not to touch him there. But everything else has changed in ways both profound and surprisingly subtle. Maxwell is beside me now, close enough that our shoulders touch without either of us thinking about it. His head is tilted back against the cushions, eyes closed, one hand resting on my thigh with the casual intimacy of someone who no longer questions his right to that contact. The late afternoon light filters through my single window, casting the same golden shadows it always has, but the quality of silence between us is transformed completely. Where once there was tension and careful distance, now there is simply peace. The books are still stacked in precarious towers throughout my apartment. The coffee cups still accumulate faster than I can wash them, and my dissertation still sprawls across my desk in various states of completion. But these familiar details feel different now, touched by the presence of someone who belongs here not as a visitor, but as an essential part of the landscape. Maxwell's jacket hangs on the back of my kitchen chair. His coffee mug, the blue one he claimed as his own after our 3rd night together, sits in the sink next to mine. Small evidence of a life being shared rather than simply observed. We don't talk about the transformation as much as you might expect. There was no dramatic conversation after that first kiss, no lengthy analysis of what it meant or where it would lead us. Instead, we simply began existing differently, inhabiting the same spaces we always had, but with new permissions, new freedoms, new ways of touching and being touched. The change felt less like revolution and more like recognition, as if we had finally allowed ourselves to acknowledge something that had always been true. Maxwell still shows up at my door most evenings, but he no longer carries the careful tension that used to define his presence here. He moves through my apartment now with the easy confidence I had always admired in other contexts, settling onto my couch or rifling through my refrigerator with the unconscious familiarity of someone who knows he is welcome. When he laughs at something I've said, there is no longer that split-second delay while he processes whether the response is appropriate. When he reaches for my hand, there is no hesitation, no moment of internal negotiation about what the gesture might mean or invite. The touching, which had once been such a source of electric tension between us, has become natural and unremarkable. Maxwell's hand finds mine while we watch movies, his fingers intertwining with mine with the same unconscious ease that other people display when adjusting a pillow or reaching for a drink. Sometimes he falls asleep with his head on my shoulder, and I no longer freeze with the fear of disturbing something precious and fragile. I simply adjust my position to make us both more comfortable and continue reading or working until he wakes. But perhaps the most significant change is in Maxwell himself. The careful performance he had maintained for so long, the easy charm, the reflexive confidence, the armor of jokes and casual deflection, has given way to something quieter and more genuine. He speaks more slowly now, thinks before responding to questions that once would have triggered automatic answers. There's a thoughtfulness in his expressions that wasn't there before, as if allowing himself to want something he had never imagined wanting has opened up space for other kinds of honesty as well. Sometimes I catch him looking at me with an expression of mild amazement, as if he still can't quite believe that this version of his life is real. Other times, usually when he thinks I'm not paying attention, I see him study our joined hands with the focused concentration of someone trying to memorize something important. These moments remind me that this transformation, however natural it feels now, required genuine courage from both of us, but especially from him, who had to rebuild his understanding of himself in order to make room for what we have become. We still watch terrible movies and eat takeout and argue about philosophy and the relative merits of different coffee shops. Maxwell still makes jokes that aren't quite funny enough to justify how hard they make me laugh. I still work too late and drink too much coffee and leave books scattered across every surface. In many ways, our friendship has remained exactly what it always was, just with new dimensions, new permissions, new ways of caring for each other. But when his hand finds mine now, there are no boundaries to navigate, no internal negotiations about appropriateness or meaning. When I touch his face or his hair or the vulnerable curve of his neck, he doesn't freeze with indecision. He simply leans into the contact with the easy acceptance of someone who has finally stopped fighting himself. The couch we sit on is the same one where this all began, where Maxwell first said, "Don't touch me," there while his body refused to move away. I think about that night sometimes, about the impossible position we had created for ourselves, about the weeks of careful dancing around what we both wanted but couldn't name. It seems both incredibly distant and vividly present, like a dream you can't quite shake even after waking. Now, when I let my hand drift to that same place on his thigh, Maxwell doesn't speak at all. He just shifts slightly to make the contact more comfortable for both of us, then continues whatever conversation we were having as if nothing unusual has occurred. Because nothing unusual has occurred. This is simply how we are now, how we have learned to be with each other. The words that once tried to hold us apart, "Don't touch me there," have been replaced by a different kind of language entirely. Not the desperate whispers of that first kiss or the careful negotiations of early intimacy, but the quiet fluency of two people who have learned to trust what their bodies have always known. The stillness that once spoke louder than words has become simply stillness. Comfortable, unremarkable, shared. And in that silence, we have found the space to finally be exactly who we are.